Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Giselle Donnelly and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined today by my colleagues
Yulia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington University, and
Dalibor Rohat, also with AEI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that have emerged along the line that runs from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why these issues matter to the United States. Today, we're going to talk very specifically about why the war in Ukraine matters to the United States, because there's a growing concern among many Americans, and particularly among Republicans and Republican candidates, that our interests are not really engaged in Ukraine. So we very much want to try to feel our way through these issues and to try to explain why, in fact, the outcome of the Ukraine war is very important to Americans. If you enjoy our discussion in this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Yulia and Dalibor, I would like to begin briefly, if I can, and exercise several ghosts that I have going back a number of years in my career, serving as a scribe to a variety of national defense and national security review commissions, where it was my job to translate the conclusions of a bipartisan group of distinguished Americans whose job it was to review the formal security and strategy documents produced by the Pentagon and administrations past more broadly. And in particular, it was important. Much of the work of those commissions focused on defining what, in fact, were American geopolitical and strategic interests. And there was remarkable consistency and agreement on this. If I could summarize what I wrote time and time again, it would sound something like this. As a global power, the United States is concerned first in securing its citizens and the contiguous and the United States itself, the territories that are part of the United States. But there's more to it than that. As a global power, the United States has global interests. In particular, we care about three important balances of power that go into making up the international order, as it is called. That's the balance of power in Europe, which has been the longest standing American geopolitical interest, the balance of power in East Asia, in the Western Pacific, likewise a longstanding interest, and certainly since the 1970s, the balance of power, or even since 1945, in the meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and the Saudi kings, the balance of power in the Middle East region. Moreover, there are a couple of sort of related regions or theaters that are important. As a global nation, as a trading nation, as a commercial nation, we're interested in being able to use the seas, the skies, near-Earth space, and now cyberspace, as it's called, for purposes of commerce without interruption by adversaries. And finally, and one thing that really distinguishes an American approach to the world from other people's approach to the world is that we are driven by our political principles. We consider these material interests not simply moral interests, or rather, maybe it's better to say we see the intersection between our material and our moral interests. And if I could just offer that as a straw man, a framework for the discussion that we're going to have, I think it may be a good way to try to dissect the subject and to try to see whether the war in Ukraine meets these yardsticks or how it measures up against these traditional tests, long-standing, widely agreed elements of American security architecture. So I just toss that out there. Feel free to set it on fire or pick it apart.
Before Dalibor gets ready to set it on fire, I want to interject the other straw man in the room that Giselle has been elegant enough not to mention. And that's obviously DeSantis, who says Ukraine is not a vital interest. Now, according to Giselle's definition, he has no idea what he talks about. So, so then over to you, Dalibor. How do we
Yeah, you said it, not me, Yulia.
how do we marry or divorce national interests from Ukraine in the perspective of from the perspective of DeSantis and from the opposite perspective where I think all of us stand?
I think there is a decision we have to make in the course of this conversation, the earlier the better, about the sort of arguments we want to engage with. So when Governor DeSantis put out that statement last week, where he said that U.S. vital interests concern our southern border and our geopolitical competition with China, I would argue that that definition uh, falls short of what somebody like Giselle just articulated, and just leaves out many important components of what our geopolitical interests really are. So I think it might be more productive to focus on arguments put forward by people like Senator Hawley or Elbridge Colby or Kevin Roberts, and Elbridge Colby wrote an opinion piece together for the Time magazine this week, where they say that we live in a world in which we have to prioritize, right? So all that sort of things that Giselle listed are certainly valid. It is in our interest that Ukraine prevails in defending its country. But given that resources are limited, US leaders have to make decisions about where to focus and where to allocate money, manpower, weapon systems, etc. And the corollary of that argument is that by focusing on Ukraine and spending 113 billion on Ukraine, we are making it more difficult to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I think that's the sort of argument that we want to tackle in this conversation, and I try to sort of present it in as fair-minded way as possible so that we can now delve into it.
Well, I think also, as long as we're naming names here, we have to mention Donald Trump, who is really the ghost in the room and the magnetic attraction that is pulling the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives and candidates like Governor DeSantis into the orbit that he has established over, since he has become a presidential candidate. Yeah, I think we need to, Dalibor, address these things head on, but not lose sight of the fact. And I don't want to succumb prematurely to the idea that strategy making is simply a set or an exercise in numerically prioritizing things. If what we're trying to achieve is a systemic order, simply to cut off a couple legs of the stool isn't going to mean is going to collapse the stool as easily as failure to address perhaps the principal threats. But by all means, let's dive into it and try to fit Ukraine into the traditional construct of American interests.
With the danger of making this more broad than it necessarily needs to be, but trying to address this part of policymakers, thinkers that are trying to shape US strategy, I think there's maybe two things that at least help me, but I'm hoping help others too, to make sense of this. To me, it's a matter of degree. I'm not sure Donald Trump himself would have the same list as DeSantis, the way DeSantis has created this list of priorities, because he for a particular reason, chose America First, World War II, logo of we won't be intervening. And actually, we didn't intervene until territorial defense. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum of this prioritization. DeSantis seems to be picking from Giselle's broad list and saying, well, let's either one or the other. We need to prioritize. And this is kind of the larger point that helps me understand this. I think it's wrong conceptually to think about it as either or, but rather I think we should think about it on a spectrum. I think DeSantis is arguing if one end of the spectrum is Coast Guard and territorial defense, that's a one. And at the other end of the spectrum is interventionism everywhere at any time, that's a 10. DeSantis seems to be on a 2 to 3. And if we are defining national interest in a matter of degree and in a matter of global power, then that means alliances, that means partnerships, and that means being able to do more things than one at the same time. And even more so, and that maybe brings us to European security as one of the three elements that Giselle listed earlier, even more so if we're looking at how different the 21st century security, national security too, is from 20th century, 19th century. We know and we'll get into that a bit later in the conversation, we know that we cannot think of Ukraine, Russia without China. We cannot think of Ukraine, Russia without European partners. And we can certainly not think about Ukraine, Russia without the United States. What would that look like? What would European security broadly look like without the United States' help, right? This is kind of the problem where we're stuck.
If I may, I think there are two sort of distinct issues which are at play. The first one is this question of trade-offs, right? By doing more in one theater, we can do less in the other theater. That's one sort of like thing that we might want to focus on. The other one is this question of connections that exist between the two theaters. So, this question of why is it that Xi Jinping went to Moscow, and why is it that the Japanese Prime Minister was in Kiev? Why is it that Eastern Europeans are investing heavily into their ties with Taiwan in some cases, and how that sort of fits into the picture of the sort of order that America has created and the alliance structures that we've created. And I think both of these are really important. But it comes to this first question of trade-offs. I think at some very basic level, it is true that if you put a Patriot battery in Ukraine, you can't simultaneously put it in Taiwan, right? So people who say, well, spending more here, we have fewer resources there. Like at face value, it's a valid claim. Setting aside this question of the state of our defense industrial base and how can that be tackled, and I think Giselle has thoughts on that. I just wanted to say that the solution which is proposed by Colby and Roberts and Hawley and others is just wrong-headed, in the sense that they say Europeans should be able to address this problem on their own. Our first order priority is China, and therefore we should just cut Ukraine loose and let Europeans deal with that. I think that just neglects this question of how you induce Europeans to step up. And if we know anything from recent history, it is that you don't get Europeans to step up by just sort of abandoning the fight by walking away. I mean, that achieves the exact opposite effect. I mean, it provides a permission structure, so to speak, for Germans and the French to do less rather than to do more. I mean, the way we got Leopards into Ukraine was by providing 31 Abrams tanks, and so I think it's just completely wrong-headed to assume, as many self-styled realists do, that we'll get our friends to do more by doing less ourselves. I just think that doesn't really work at all.
Just to pick up on your point, Dalibor, can we start to try to start small, sort of small, not really small, but can we define both what the good outcomes? I mean, let's talk about Europe per se, so we can at least establish what the trade-offs entail. What is to be won in Europe and what might be lost in Europe, because the original sort of realist critique was that the Russians have a legitimate sphere of influence that includes Ukraine, and it's sort of the glacis of depth in Eastern Europe, and that we should acknowledge sort of the legitimacy of Russian supposed security concerns. So why don't we just start by outlining what the risks and benefits are to the European balance, and then try to place that in the larger global context?
Well, isn't it on the one hand that if the United States, let's go the one scenario, the extreme scenario of DeSantis, the DeSantis group, let's call it that. If the United States today in a year says, let's not deliver military aid anymore. Let's, based on what Dalibor was saying, let's have the Europeans fend for themselves. Then we have two elements. On the one side, we have Ukraine failing, right? There's no way that the Europeans have, and I'll go into this in a second, either the political will or the capabilities to sustain Ukraine by themselves, because Russia is a military power, because Ukraine has the largest territory of a European country, etc. And then we have a European mess on our hands, right? We can argue that it wouldn't lead to Russia immediately going into NATO territory, and it depends on what president will be in the White House, etc. But sooner or later, in any way, even beyond Ukraine, if we think Ukraine is not as important as European security broadly, we have a huge mess on our hands, and we can say bye-bye to European security in the fragile way that it exists right now. And then on the other hand, we must be looking into exactly the patterns that already exist and that Dalibor was mentioning. So maybe to spell it out even more, Central and Eastern Europeans, there's differences between them, but they're doing more than they can. They're doing per capita, many of them way more than the United States is doing, because to them it's existential. It is about European security, etc. Western European countries will say, well, this is not existential to us, at least not now. And so if the American leader is not doing more, then why would we? And so either way, you have politically, and not just in security, hard security terms, a catastrophic outcome of European security, way more unstable, way more problematic than we have it already now in this very fragile state, right?
Dalibor, what's your take?
What strikes me as important is that if the US were really to sort of give up on Ukraine and perhaps even on NATO, then I mean the realists are correct that Europe in principle has the resources to deter a Russian invasion. I mean, gosh, even Poles on their own would probably defeat the Russians, like if there were an actual fight put on. But by sort of withdrawing from Eastern Europe in this fashion, we just give up any leverage over the sort of shape of the outcomes that materialize as a result of that. You can imagine a situation in which European strategic autonomy with grumbling sort of Germans and French stepping up a little bit is just enough to deter the Russians from parts of Eastern Europe that are currently part of the EU and NATO. Yet the broader region becomes a hot mess, like it's been in the Balkans, where Ukraine is permanently unstable, and where Europeans might not be in a position to do more on their own. And the question is whether like that's a sort of European continent we can live with and be comfortable with. And I would argue that it's not. More importantly, it sort of connects to this question of what our own big ticket priorities are. And if we want to compete with China, I would venture to say that we need allies to do that we would want to bring the world's third largest economy along, namely the European Union, and you have to find ways to elicit European cooperation on something like China, where we would be demanding them to make economic sacrifices of various kinds. So by just sort of cutting Ukraine loose, by saying, well, you Europeans should fend for yourselves, it's the exact opposite way as the one that we should be pursuing if we want to actually build an alliance to contain China, or sort of deter China from doing bad things in the Indo-Pacific.
And before we segue entirely to China, because I think these different battlefields, potential battlefields, are artificially separated, and it's worth pondering on that. It's also, and Giselle can maybe speak to that much better than anybody else, at least on this call. And that is it really a zero-sum game, or is it actually just rhetoric? And there's a lot to gain from investing into Ukraine now. We already made the argument that the shorter this is, the less costly it will be, but that has the premise that we're in for the long run. But if we're looking at just the battlefield and just the investments, sure, we're shipping military aid into Ukraine, but the list of military capabilities that the United States is and can even more produce, in the shopping list of countries, allies around the world, and partners from Central and Eastern Europeans all the way to Japan and Korea, is just getting longer and longer. Now it's a matter of how much can the United States produce in HIMARS, in Patriots. But isn't that the opposite of a blank check? Isn't that actually making money?
So we can sort of keep on track. I'm just going to, give my bottom line assessment of what's at stake. First of all, and maybe I've taken this whole Eastern Front thing too much to heart, but if Ukraine were to be, or Russia were to come out of it, let's look at it from a Moscow point of view, with something that they could believe was a success, then for us, the cost of stabilizing Europe and securing the Eastern Front, even if it's just NATO member states, will increase. It will increase a lot, as will the risk of further conflict. So defending the Eastern Front that includes Ukraine is one proposition, and we should not delude ourselves. I mean, the fact that this war has expanded from what it was prior to last February means that international or European security is the central issue in transatlantic relations. So you can't undo that. So I would just say the risks are greater and the costs are higher if Russia, quote unquote, prevails in some sense. Whereas if Ukraine wins, the prospects for restabilizing the continent and returning to a secure peace and the prosperity that has come with it is immeasurably enhanced. The military alliance is more coherent and stronger, and the cost to the United States will be much, much less. And the likelihood that European powers of one kind or another will bandwagon, to use a horrible term of political science, with us, rather than hedge against further Russian aggression, seem to me, sort of immeasurably greater if there's a positive outcome. Europe will be less a distraction if Ukraine wins and more of a distraction from dealing with China if Russia prevails.
Maybe we want to move on from this just a few inches to this question of the connections between what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Asia.
Sounds good.
When Senator Hawley gave his speech at the Heritage Foundation uh, recently, he mocked those who believe that, and I quote, defending Ukraine is basically the same thing as deterring China. That if one dictator is allowed to seize territory by force, it will embolden others. And so stopping Putin is basically the same thing as stopping Xi Jinping. He calls this magical thinking. He blames what he calls the uniparty for this view of the war in Ukraine. I guess uniparty, it's people like us. So, center right, center left, the blob, whatever you want to call it.
I've
Good to
never
know.
been so insulted.
And
Thank you,
and
Dog
so
Boy.
so it's funny that he makes this argument at the time that Xi Jinping goes to Moscow and negotiates basically a yuanization of Russia, negotiates unlimited oil gas supplies from Russia to China, arguably at advantageous prices, and the same time that he peddles this peace plan for Ukraine. And Bruno Massage, whom we haven't had on the podcast yet, but we might want to bring him on at some point, tweeted yesterday that it's clear after this visit that there are two possible outcomes to this war. One is a Ukrainian victory, and the other one is some version of the Chinese peace plan, an outcome that would arguably strengthen China's position, including in Eastern Europe. And
No, I agree completely. You know what's remarkable. Try it one more time. Remarkable about the arguments for prioritizing China is Elbridge Colby and Senator Hawley apparently haven't talked to any Asians in this regard, because you're quite correct. You were quite correct to point out that the Japanese Prime Minister arrived in Kyiv the same day that Xi Jinping was in Moscow. Presumably, the Japanese know what they're doing. Okay, I think they can speak for themselves, and the same is true of other Asian nations who clearly see two things: that there is a geopolitical connection between what
Xi
happens in Europe
Jinping
and what
sees that
happens in
connection
East Asia,
clearly.
and what. Yes, well, why? Yes, exactly. That's why he was in Moscow, and they see it as critical. I mean, what is true in Europe is also true in East Asia. That is, without the linchpin of American power, the whole thing is in danger of unraveling. We saw this after 9/11, in particular, where there were South Korean soldiers who were in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our allies will try very hard to support us if they can, and that is especially true of frontline states, as in Eastern Europe, so in East Asia. The Japanese, the Australians, the same way. So, again, I'm just struck by those who are, we must prioritize China, we must prioritize the Indo-Pacific. Don't listen to voices from the Indo-Pacific.
And if I can just, so the other side of this of this coin is the fact that the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which are often small but very active allies of ours, which are very concerned about Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, are also at the forefront of pushing the European debate on China in a more hawkish direction. I'll mention Lithuania, which has decided to just live with Chinese economic sanctions and a ban on Lithuanian imports into China, for allowing a Taiwanese de facto embassy to open in Vilnius. The Czech Republic is sending a delegation of 150 lawmakers and diplomats and business people to Taiwan in 3 days, led by the Speaker of Parliament. These countries are not doing that because of their deep-seated love for Taiwan. I mean, there is certainly solidarity with sort of small democratic nation which is facing, difficult and aggressive neighbors. That's certainly part of the story. But another part of the story is that they are playing this for an audience in Washington, trying to signal, we are willing to help, we are willing to go out of our way to be helpful and step up. And reciprocally, we would hope that you take our own existential concerns about our own security seriously. And the way, a future DeSantis administration is going to build a transatlantic alliance to contain China is precisely by encouraging these small countries and giving them more voice and empowering them to shift the overall European conversation in a sort of more hawkish direction. I mean, there are other countries that share the same concerns, but it's far from a consensus view across the EU. And you simply, if you want to deal with Huawei and TikTok and Chinese intellectual property theft, like you have to have the EU on board collectively as a whole. It just makes the job so much easier.
To kind of sum up both of your points and draw it back to DeSantis, because we cannot help ourselves. I think the main problem.
Yulia, I think you should come 5 times a week for, exorcism of your
I'm waiting for his staff to call me.
Okay.
But I do think that what these DeSantises, Trumpies, don't understand, that their biggest mistake when it comes to national security of the United States, and here due credit to the Biden administration, frankly, is exactly this part, which sounds boring and tedious and doesn't have short-term gains, but is really essential, and that is allies and alliances, and the power of, I would call it, American glue, because it's the United States is the reason why South Korea, directly or indirectly, South Korea and Japan are becoming for the first time real actors in Central and Eastern Europe. The United States is the one who's been pushing across Europe for a decoupling from China, decoupling from Huawei under the Trump administration, to their credit, in this context, and now pushing for more ties with Taiwan. And it also then highlights exactly how willing to sacrifice and to ally and bandwagon really frontline states are, because these are the ones that are standing out now in Europe and in East Asia compared to other allies. Also important, also essential when it comes to trade and economics and the greater picture. But it's the United States push and frontline allies response that really helps in the end fight any kinds of fights, whether that's with Russia or with China or in the Middle East, or beyond. And without them, back to Dalibor's point, I don't think even a global power such as the United States on their own, without any support, but rather undermined by potential partners and allies, can stand against anyone.
Can we talk directly about a theme that sort of bubbled under the surface in a couple of our last comments, and that is the sort of reputational influence of American power and how that's. My view would be that since the withdrawal from Iraq, particularly, but also Afghanistan and the particularly chaotic last bit of our involvement in Afghanistan, I mean, and red lines in Syria, and then failure to respond to the invasion of Georgia in an effective way, or to the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. Many of our most stalwart, critical allies, and you have to say, or wonder in particular about our East Asian allies, have some reason to question American political will and resolve and staying power, and the like. Again, if we contemplate two different outcomes in Ukraine, one would seem to go a long way to restoring confidence in American power, whereas the kind of Trumpy DeSantis isolationism that we've been describing would really have catastrophic consequences. The willingness to stand with the United States and to follow an American lead, I think, would take a precipitous fall if we bugged out on the Ukrainians, not to put too fine a point on it.
I mean, there's this idea that, like, by doing less, we somehow get more equitable burden sharing across alliances, and others will step up. And unless we sort of refuse to hold everybody by their hand, like they will always be dependent on us. And I mean, the problem with that is that, of course, by doing less, we are sending a signal not only to our allies to step up, but we are sending a signal to everybody that, now America won't be involved or won't enforce certain red lines. That sends a signal to those of our allies who might be ambivalent about us, and encourage them to look for alternatives to an alliance with the US. And it more importantly sends a signal to our adversaries that they can now test the boundaries of what they can get away with, and just collectively, like, it makes for a much more dangerous world if you sort of take both of these things together. It just creates more instability, more willingness to on the part of sort of rogue actors to test our red lines and expose our initial commitments and pledges as hollow, ideally. And it just, like how that's conducive to US interests, I frankly don't know. Like, it just makes our job much harder.
Yulia, can you give us the view from Bucharest on this? I mean, yeah, it seems to me particularly apropos. Where security is tenuous at the best of times, sort of in many ways, to the degree that we can see Romania as kind of someone whose instincts or in hopes lie with the West, but feel again like a frontline state that could be exposed to pernicious influence.
I don't know if I can do it strictly from Bucharest, but I'll try to do it from a few frontline states, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, and try to find what they have in common and where I see the biggest dangers. Someone told me a while ago, well, someone not from Romania, telling me, well, Romania has no place to go. They have to be bandwagoning with the United States. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Look at Orban in Hungary. Look at Erdogan in Turkey. There's many places to go. They're nasty places. They're isolationists. There's not only the United States that can be isolationist and short-sighted, but these countries too. And it's really hard to make that argument here because, again, it doesn't bring, we are forced here in Washington to be somewhat short sighted because we have to deal with one catastrophe or one crisis at a time. But we also kind of know, again, it's that tedious argument that it takes long-term investments, that it takes soft power and reassurances to be able to, in the end, because it is about that to me too, pay less, right? How do we think about the Ukraine war, a potential war in around Taiwan, or any others, in making us more efficient in how we go about it, and how do we not write blank checks? And the only way, in my understanding from the frontline perspectives, to do that is to think long term and invest more efficiently now so that it doesn't cost later a lot more. I know this is kind of a very pragmatic frontline calculation, but in the end, this is what I guess both Washington and frontline states have in common, that we all have to think in terms of costs, political costs, economic costs, security costs. And it just seems so obvious to me in the context of European security and beyond, that if you fix it now and think about it in a coherent way, it will cost you less later. Also, back to you, Giselle, in terms of reputational costs.
Well, I'm going to punt over to Dalibor for his comments on either the value or the overstated value of reputational power.
Well, there's reputational power, but I think we should also not lose sight of just the commitment that is required of the United States to help Ukrainians win and what that would mean, right? So like we don't really have that many near peer competitors or foes around the world. Uh, Although China is the bigger of the top two, I mean Russia has been a problem for a long time. If Ukrainians can sort of knock out the Russian military from being able to inflict damage on third countries for the next 2 decades, and if it costs us 5% of the Pentagon budget, so be it. Like, how is that not a good deal? That to me is a sort of question we should be asking people who say that it's foolish for us to support Ukraine to the extent to which we have, or perhaps even more. I mean, it's nobody is talking about U.S. servicemen, service women going to Ukraine and fighting. Nobody's. It's not a forever war. It's like somebody else is fighting. Yeah, writing a modest check every year, and we would all want it to be over soon. That's why we, the three of us would like to write a bigger check and get it done this year. Like that to me is just sort of rational, prudent, realistic thinking, as opposed to this idea that, yeah, I mean, like there are real sort of material trade-offs. I presume, like you are not going to make like hundreds of new Patriot batteries this year and deliver them to Taiwan, like if need be. I mean, it's
well, you weren't going to do that anyway.
But I mean, the sort of response to that issue is to just like become more serious as a country that does face serious geopolitical challenges, including in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we just have to expand the sort of defense industrial base, and in a way, the war in Ukraine has been helpful in sort of propelling that conversation forward and exposing the gaps and sort of raising some urgency around fixing those shortcomings. We probably wouldn't have that same conversation over Taiwan if it weren't for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's why I think it's a little disingenuous when people sort of invoke these sorts of trade-offs and say, well, we can't really be spending all this money in Ukraine when it's needed, the money and resources and munitions in Taiwan, because I wonder if they had been making the argument for spending this money and these resources in Taiwan had the war in Ukraine not taken place.
Well, and I think we should have a little bit more nuanced understanding of the East Asian theater. One of the things that is almost a direct refutation of this "we can't walk and chew gum at the same time" argument is that just the other day we completed an agreement with the Philippines, which we have been seeking for decades, to return to Clark Air Base there, which is the key facility for contesting Chinese ambitions in the South China Sea. It was a terrible mistake of the first Bush administration to not work harder to try to negotiate a continued U.S. presence in Southeast Asia. But now we're back, and the connections between the spine that the Biden administration has shown in Ukraine and this long back and forth with a variety of Philippine leaders over can we come back and under what conditions, has been at last resolved now in our favor. Again, correlation does not imply causality, but it certainly puts the lie to this: we must do only things that are directly related to the defense of Taiwan, and everything else, we'll just ignore. I wonder if in our final section we could speculate briefly, because we're time constrained here, about the domestic political ramifications. And I'd just like to offer one final straw man for torching it. So much, first of all, the whole marriage of the Republican Party and the MAGA movement has been a disaster for the Republican Party. They've managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in the last several elections. what happens to and let's set Trump aside just because he's in a universe of his own, but what does DeSantis look like as an applicant to be commander in chief if, as is most likely, the story from for the remainder of this year is again Russian weakness and Ukrainian success? In that case, it seems to me DeSantis looks like somebody who is trying to embrace losing, whereas, especially if his opponent is Joe Biden, he can make a claim to be, a if not a war-winning president, then somebody who's put American interests on a path toward victory in Ukraine. I just can't see how that, how the DeSantis position, as currently formulated, is necessarily a great, he sacrificed the general election to win the hearts of MAGA.
Well, it's funny, isn't it, that if like things continue on the current pattern, like we are likely to end up in Ukraine with some sort of inconclusive mess,
Frozen conflict.
that Biden will have to somehow defend going into the election, in which point the sort of natural line of attack for Republicans would be to say that the Biden administration just wasn't taking this seriously, wasn't doing what was needed, was trying to do it on the cheap, and therefore, the sort of like Nikki Haley perspective would be, I think, much more sort of effective at sort of damaging the president's record going into the election on that front. Like if DeSantis basically positions himself the way he has in that statement, like there is very little daylight between him and what the administration is doing, right? Like he's not saying that we should cut off all aid to Ukraine. He was against stepping up in our assistance and providing long range artillery and F-16s and things that would be seen as escalatory. And he basically, I think, deprives himself of the possibility of saying, well, we should have been far more forceful, which is kind of weird for somebody who probably will want to present himself as sort of Mr. Tough Guy, peace through strength candidate in the general election. And conversely, like what is making this even more puzzling is that if you are President Biden and you're looking at the situation, like, and you know that you are facing an election in 2024, wouldn't you want to do everything for the Ukrainians so that they actually win, and so that you can actually show this as an example of your leadership and sort of successful managing of alliances, rather than the situation that we have on the ground today, which, I mean, could be altered by a successful Ukrainian offensive, but I think we are still very far away from a point in which Ukrainians retake full control of their territory, which is what really should be the goal of the administration, especially if it wants to sort of create a record that's worth running on.
I'm a bit more cynical here, and I think in this context, DeSantis has the smart upper hand, because we know that for Biden himself, the break of this full-scale invasion was the worst nightmare, right? That was not his plan, an indirect war with Russia, Russian full-scale aggression on the European continent, etc. And we also know that Biden has been doing his best in his assessment to give Ukrainians the upper hand when he was taken by surprise by the fact that Zelensky did not want a ride, and when his strategy is driven by fear. So with this element of driven by fear, which deters him from giving the Ukrainians what they're asking for to finish this rather sooner than later, DeSantis looks less fearful, right? He looks like, well, I wouldn't have done this mess anyway. I can get us out of this mess. It's not Russia and a responsible conversation about nukes that is the problem. It's the problem of getting us into this mess in the first place.
I just think it's a little bit simpler than that. I think, even if Ukraine can't get to a complete victory, prior to the election season next year, Biden can legitimately say, "Hey, I was hoping that this wouldn't happen. I took steps to try to deter at the last minute the Russians, but I have risen to the occasion. Carefully, maybe not as forcefully or as rapidly as the three of us would have liked, but in a contest with a let's bug out." And I don't think you can sort of say, well, I'm just not going to increase support to Ukraine, but I'm going to turn the rheostat down by 25%, or, however they're going to try to square the circle of this. There's going to be what should be an easy contrast for any competent campaign to paint of a president who stood up to Russian aggression and one that wants to kowtow before it. And particularly now that Russia and China are so clearly linked, to say, yeah, sure, I kowtowed to Russia, but I would stand up to Xi Jinping is just not a credible argument. I mean, again, in a contest of, for the id of the American people, this who's going to let the bully kick sand in our face sort of dichotomy should be easy for President Biden, assuming he's the nominee, to draw.
On that note.
That's a happy note for the Eastern Front. Let's stop now.
That's right.
Let's also hope that our listeners have benefited from the discussion, even if you don't agree with us, although you should agree with us, and that when you're trying to figure out exactly what American interests are in regard not only to Ukraine, but to Eastern Europe, that we be the source of information for you. So
everybody should use the hashtag Eastern Front Pod written as one word to let us know why we are right or wrong on Twitter.
There you go. Right. So let's just use that as the outro rather than the full version, and just say goodbye and thank you to our listeners for putting up with us. I'm Giselle Donnelly, and for me and
Julia Zoja and
thanks for listening to our podcast. We always talk about the security challenges that extend from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, what we call the Eastern Front. As Dalibor has suggested, you can find much more content, more episodes, our newsletter, our monthly newsletter at aei.org. As I said earlier, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And finally, give us a ping on Twitter. The hashtag is one word, hashtag Eastern Front Pod. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.